Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I'm here for my LCK week number 7 overview and analysis video. Here in the spring split, we are getting closer and closer to the playoffs. There really isn't a lot of time left to stake your claim. Top 6 does feel relatively decided in terms of the teams that are going to be making it, but the way that we end up getting there is certainly still up for debate, and the confidence with which those teams go into the playoffs is still very much to be determined, and we're gonna get a lot closer to that in today's video. Of course, let me know what you guys are thinking of the LCK down in the comment section below. What teams are impressing you? What teams are not impressing you, especially as we get closer to playoff time? What teams do you think are going to overperform maybe what their record says? And what teams do you think maybe aren't gonna do so well once we get into the best of 5 stage? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you want to know mine on everything that's happened in the LCK so far, you can check out the LCK playlist up in the iCard right now. That's gonna give you a good idea of where I'm at, obviously, if you watch all of those videos. But today we're going to be going over week 7, the 10 series that happened this previous week. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. If you are new here, what we're going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and at the end of the week, I'll be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week for week 7 to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Of course, we will also be updating my power rankings from number 1 to number 10, kind of going over where I think of a lot of these teams at the moment. And again, especially with playoffs around the corner, you want to be peaking at the right time. You don't just want to have a good record, you want to be in good form. So this week's very important for a lot of teams, but without further ado, let's jump into the analysis. Of course, in the LCK, we've got 5 days, and we get to start off with day number 1, and we don't quite get the playoff teams just yet, but we do get a fun series between 2 and 10 teams, OK Brion and DRX, that Bro is going to be able to take 2-1. These are 2 of the bottom 3 teams pretty clearly in the LCK, in my opinion, and they played like it in this series. It was not particularly good from either of them. I think that there were a couple of good plays made by Bro, and that was enough to make the difference to push them across the finish line, but, you know, it's not like either of these teams are changing my mind because of this series. Bro gets a little bit more confidence after DRX was actually able to pick up their second win of the split last week. You know, both of these teams, I think, have been playing better as of late, but how much does that really mean? Like, at the end of the day, playing better just means that they're beating each other and not necessarily beating anybody else. So let's get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Morgan in the top lane. This was a no-brainer. Really, the biggest problem this series for, you know, DRX, and the biggest advantage that Bro had was just the massive top gap that was the final 2 games. Yes, Rascal was very good in game 1, but game 1 was very DRX favor just across the board. Everybody was really able to get ahead and start doing well. You know, Sponge, Yehu, Teddy, Pliata, I think all also played well, but Rascal's engages on the Malphite were very important in terms of speeding up the process of that game. But outside of that, games 2 and 3 were a disaster from Rascal. We will get into that, and Morgan took advantage of that, just absolutely brutalized him in the 1v1 top lane matchup. His Aatrox was great, his Renekton was great. I think game 2 was a little bit more impressive for me personally, but the game 3 was still really good, and he was able to take over this series with a couple of really well-timed engages in the middle of fights. When you're playing like a mid-line engager like Renekton and Aatrox are, you really need to make sure that your positioning is good, because really your job is to separate the carries and the frail members of the team from their protectors, from their peelers, from Pliata, from Sponge in this case. And so I think obviously Morgan did a great job of that, and he's been playing better as of late. He had a little bit of a down start to the split. Wasn't awful, but, you know, again, this is the same player he's been for a while. A good player on a bad team. Maybe not a great player, but a good player on a bad team. I do think, obviously, you got to shout out Envy. He played really well in the Smolder in game 3, but hyperscaling AD carries have just become the rage, not only in the LCK, but everywhere. And when hyperscalers are common in pro play, you know the LCK is going to take advantage of that. That is the style that all of these ADCs play the most, and Envy definitely wanted to go towards that. So when you get the, you know, 2 games of Zeri and a Smolder coming out from Envy, and you got a Senna on the other side of this map, it just kind of is what it is. But Envy was the one that got funneled in this series, and so he was the one that was able to get a little bit further along. Polu was a lot better. He was really, really bad last week, was dud of the week for me in week 6, but definitely played better in this series, and Gideon and Karis were fine. Karis was a little bit overextended, was probably the one player on the team that I wanted to see maybe play a little bit safer, but Karis isn't particularly good, so I'm not surprised to see some positioning mistakes. Overall, Morgan was the best player though, and you were able to get your hyper carry ahead, and that means that it was a pretty easy win for Bro. But for DRX on the other side, Dud of the series is easily going to go to Rascal. Like I said, top lane mega gap in this series. The Malphite was good in game 1, but the Jax and the Udyr, awful. I mean, just really unplayably bad, and this just goes back to Rascal having not been good for like the last year. I really don't think that this guy, I'm not going to say it's entirely him being washed, because obviously mental does play into it at least a little bit. This team was bad last year, this team is bad this year, and so I can't imagine it's like easy to put in your full effort every single game, but he's getting mechanically gapped in all of these games in lane, and Morgan's a decent player, but Rascal should be better than Morgan, and he's just not. He's a bottom 1, bottom 2 top laner in the LCK at this point, and I think that's become abundantly clear, and it sucks because I actually do think some of the young players on this team are starting to get a bit better. I think Yehu has made this team better than what Satab was, doing in the mid lane. I think Sponge is definitely playing better ever since Yehu came in, even if he's still making a lot of over-aggressive mistakes and isn't exactly a perfect player. He really wasn't great in this series. I think Pliata's been playing well the entirety of the split, and Teddy has good score lines. I think it's worth noting that Teddy was also kind of in the running for Dud of the series here, if only for that Senna game. In game 3, Senna had been undefeated on this big winning streak, and, obviously Teddy losing here on it sucks, like to lose that, be the one that loses on Senna, if you will, but I don't think it's entirely just that. Obviously the team's bad. I'm not going to blame him if he played bad, or if he played well and the rest of the team played bad, but I actually think that he played pretty poor towards the back half of game 3. They could have been in it, I think, if the Senna had been a little bit better, but Teddy just had really bad positioning. He made some pretty crucial mistakes and really wasn't doing anything, no damage coming out from that pick, and it ended up being a problem. Again, I'm much lower on Teddy than everybody you're going to see on Reddit who really likes him a lot, I think, as a player who has a lot of, bias and nostalgia towards him. I don't really have as much of that because I've never really been on the Teddy hype train as much as other people. He's a good AD carry that I think would look better on a better team, but he's certainly not the kind of player that's going to look good on a bad team like DRX, and so this team continues to be bad. Even over their win last week, I believe they beat Nongshim. This is just not a good team. Bottom 3 is bottom 3, and even with this win, I'm not completely changing my mind about Bro either. I still think that this team has its own problems, but Morgan did play well, and when bot lane gets funneled and you put him on a hyper carry, it should be relatively easy to execute, and so, there are some things to like, but neither of these teams are particularly good in my opinion. And then moving on to our second series of day 1, and we go from 2 bottom tier teams to 2 top tier teams very quickly here. Hanwha Life Esports taking on Gen.G. And Gen.G is going to pick up the 2-0 series win, both games being relatively dominant and in their favor. This is just the best team in the LCK at the moment. Obviously, we'll talk about them a bit more later in the week. This is one of the matchups I'm most excited to see, but they have the other matchup that I'm most excited to see. Not an easy week for Gen.G, but they started off in phenomenal fashion. For Hanwha Life, obviously, this sucks. You would have loved to at least be competitive here, but once again, like, top 2 are top 2. Losing to the top 2 is not anything bad. I think Hanwha has proven that they are clearly the third best team. I think that they are in a weird spot, and we'll talk about this. They're definitely worse than the top 2, but in my opinion, they are definitely better than 4 and 5 in DK and KT Rolster. I think it is very clear that Hanwha just sits in this weird kind of spot where they just don't really have upward or downward mobility, but at least they're in that spot, and then, Gen.G is going to take advantage of them in series like this. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Canyon. Was terrific in this series. Credit to him in game number 1. That Lee Sin is just ridiculous. He's so good at this champion. It really does feel like we're back to like peak Canyon. This is better than he played in 2023. This is better than he played in 2022. This is the best version of him, in my opinion, since the 2020, 2021, like super damn one teams. And so you've got to be excited about that. If you're Gen.G, to me, he was just the most impactful in both games, creating opportunities for the rest of the team to really take advantage. I think a lot of people are going to want to see Chovy get player of the series here, and Chovy is maybe my MVP frontrunner at the current moment with how well he's been playing. Him and Faker are really 1A, 1B in terms of how you want to take that argument, but Chovy continues to be electric in the mid lane. This guy just does everything you need him to do, whether that's carry through damage, like he kind of was able to do on the Talia in game 2, or just be more of that facilitator that's set up Assassin on the Ahri in game 1. It's just really good stuff. He does everything at a super high level. Again, there's a reason I compare Chovy and Knight so much, because they're such similar players. They're both very good at every aspect of the game, even if people don't like to tell you that they are. Also, can we please put some respect on Lahenz's name? I got a lot of comments in the offseason and the preseason that were really upset and mad that I was putting Lahenz in the same category as Keria and Delight and putting Lahenz ahead of Delight as a support. But look at these games. Like, this is is almost the perfect example for why I think Lehens is a better support than Delight, because Lehens just has this X factor where he's always going to be looking to create plays. Maybe he's not the most mechanically talented support in the entire world. He doesn't make the same kind of like flashy high mechanic plays that someone like Delight or KIA is going to make, but he is going to be looking to make those plays significantly more frequently. His mentality is top tier, and it's what's made him a top tier support. Obviously, he's still incredible mechanically. You don't get to where he is without being that, but the Alistair, the Nami, they were both ridiculously good, and again, this is just more of an example of why you should be respecting Lehens as one of the best supports in the world. Keen was very good, definitely the better top laner in this series. Pays was solid. Gen.G's just a well-oiled machine. They are so good. Maybe they're a bit slow, but they're still active when they need to be. Canyon stepping up has really increased the aggression and pacing of this team a lot over the past couple of series, and I think it's been fun to watch. They are the top team in the LCK until proven otherwise. And then for HLE on the other side, again, you're a really good team and a team that I think has a lot going for you, but your weaknesses have been pretty well documented over the course of this split. Unfortunately, Dud of the series is going to go to Doran after a really big, in my opinion, breakout year in 2023, where he was one of, if not the best top laner in the LCK, one of the best top laners in the world over the course of the whole year. It feels like he's kind of returned to what he was in 2022 here on Hanwha Life, which is a pretty solid weak side top in their winning games and somebody who's not particularly strong in their losing games. And that's really kind of a disappointing slot to be in. Doran was really kind of somebody that I was really excited to see on this team. You know, he still had Peanut, who really was the big reason that he was playing well last year. And, you know, I thought he was going to be able to carry it over, but it's just not happened. He got destroyed by Keen and was never relevant in this series. Also, I don't think Peanut played well, and that's actually starting to be a bit more of a concern. The volatility that Peanut has had this year has been more than he has had in the last couple of years. Obviously, he's always been a bit volatile. The Worlds Peanut whatever argument that isn't true. I mean, if you go look at his stats, he's been a good Worlds player for his entire career. The Worlds Peanut argument is literally just a lie, but, you know, what people say he has been at Worlds is what he's kind of being in the LCK right now, which is this player who will have good games, will also have really bad games. And the Zac, the Sedge, it just wasn't good. Canyon was better. Now, I also do want to point out that the top comment on the post-match thread is still regular season Zeka strikes again. I don't really know what else you want him to do, going 2-2-5 on Talia and being up in CS on Chovy for most of this game. Really don't know what you want to happen in this, but we've talked about it. Again, I don't want to keep going about on this rant every single week. If you haven't watched my videos, you know, shout out, but Zeka is the most scapegoated player in the world. Zeka is the one player that I think is the most disrespected by the community in the entire world. Some okay games from him. He did not lose this team this series. Neither did Viper, but Zeka and Viper have been the two good players for HLE this year. Zeka is the one winning them all of their winning games, and Viper is the most consistent player on the team by far and has maybe been the best AD carry in the LCK, and without them, they would be nowhere, because Doran and Peanut aren't playing well, and honestly, you know, Delight has his moments, but he got outplayed by Lehens in this series pretty clearly, and so there is a lot of room to grow, hopefully for HLE. They just need to get more consistent around their carries. I think if Zeka is going to unlock himself and potentially get on that Chovy or Faker level, which I don't think is going to happen, but it is possible, then I think that could really put this team in the conversation. But right now, Zeka is showmaker, right? Like, he's a really good mid laner. He's somebody who is, you know, going to be very consistent from game to game, but he's not a top 3 player in the world. He's just a top, you know, 10 player in the world, and that makes it a bit more difficult to be able to beat a team like Gen.G, and I think that's the problem HLE are running into right now. But for Gen.G on the other side, 12-1's pretty good, and again, your schedule's not getting any easier this week. You've got T1 later in the week. This was just the warm-up, and to demolish HLE, Hanwha Life Esports, the 3rd place team in your warm-up series this week, it's a pretty good sign for them. And then moving on now to day number 2, and it's a pretty intriguing matchup, playoff teams at the very least at the start of day 2 here. It's the Kwangdong Freecs taking on T1, and T1 is also going to pick up a 2-0 victory. Maybe not quite as important of a win as Gen.G was able to get on the day before, but still a nice win to go into their matchup later this week with as much confidence as possible. The 12-1 matchup is going to be a blast. Fortunately for KDF, they just have not been able to replicate some of the magic that they had in weeks 2 and 3 when they were really starting starting to break out with that new bot lane in there. It just doesn't feel like that is still there for them. They've fallen below 500 once again with this loss, and, you know, honestly, I don't think that they're going to be much better than what they are right now. Perhaps, obviously, things could get better, and I wouldn't be entirely shocked if they do, but at least for now, this has just been an okay run of form for KDF, and they're going to be a playoff team that at one time looked very difficult and very scary to have to face early on, and now it's just like everybody wants to get third place so that they can play KDF in round number 1. But let's go ahead and talk about T1 first and foremost. Player of the series was so difficult. So many players playing well for T1. KIA was amazing, specifically when he played the Kalista in game 1. He was the AD carry in game number 1. He got all of the CS. He got all of the resources, and he was able to dominate on it, so credit to him. But Owner was amazing in game 2 on the Vi. Again, almost accidentally, he was the one that was picking up a lot of the kills. He was super active on the map, and I think played in a really good manner. Faker was once again very good on Talia, really being able to enable Owner in particular in game 2. But I'm actually going to give it to Zeus in the top lane because he really kind of dominated the end game more than I think anybody else in this series was able to do. I think obviously you can criticize some of his laning. Dudu's a very good laner, and so I'm not going to freak out too much that Zeus wasn't dominating that section, but he would be going into late games, you know, down a couple CS, 0-2, not really being in a, you know, super strong position, and then just get quadra kills over and over and over again. Obviously, Aatrox is strong, but we've seen a lot of people globally play Aatrox, and not a lot of people can pull it off like this. That champion has a lot of tools, but you still have to be very good to use him, and Zeus is one of, if not the best top laner in the world, so being able to capitalize on some of the positions he was in was very important. Zeus was awesome. But once again, if you want to give it to KIA for that game 1 or Owner for that game 2, I think both of those are also pretty valid targets in this case. I just think that Zeus was a little bit more flashy and impressive to me in that sense. But credit to T1, this team continues to look basically unstoppable, just very, very dominant, and really the test is going to be later this week and not this series. But for KDF, again, there is reason to be concerned. They still are going to be a top 6 team, if only because the distance between them and every team that's below them in the standings is just too large at this point, not only in terms of the record, but in terms of the talent as well. You know, Fox and the bottom 3, they're just not going to be able to play on the same level as KDF, even if KDF is not on the same level as the other teams in the top 5. It just kind of is what it is. But a real big reason as to why this team has started to struggle again is, in my opinion, this bot lane just kind of crashing back down to earth. They were so good in weeks 2 and 3 when Bull came in and Ondol looked like he was playing at a super high level, and then Lunar New Year happened and they come back and they've both just kind of been like below average players at their position, and obviously that was expected for both of them going into the year. I don't think I or a lot of other analysts would have expected this bot lane to be tearing up the league like they were for a bit, but their regression back towards the mean I think has really hurt KDF. I still think this is an upgrade over what Taiyun was offering at the beginning of the year, but Bull has not been good in the last few series, and Ondil is going to get dud of the series here. He was really bad on the Ashe in game 1. KIA was just kind of dominating him in the laning phase, and obviously when you put KIA on something he can just mechanically gap you on, it's going to be a bit of a problem, but Ondil was not relevant in that series at all, and it's not like the Alistar was better in game 2. Bull was also just dying way too often. His positioning is too aggressive, and we're seeing a lot of the negative tendencies that we saw in the Challengers League that I talked about when he got called up and why it was such a surprise that he was doing so well. So, you know, there is real concern that this is just kind of going to be what this bot lane is for the rest of the year, and I hate to say it, it's just not good enough for this team to reach its ambitions. It's not like the rest of the team is playing great. I still think Cuz is very hit or miss for this team, very Clid-esque in terms of how he is playing, as I've said in previous weeks, and, you know, I like Bulldog, but he's just not good enough to be able to go toe-to-toe with Faker just yet. Dudu was okay in lane, but really couldn't do anything out of it. The top side was generally fine, but not good enough to be able to compete with T1, and, you know, that's kind of where KDF is at the moment. Obviously, losing this series isn't shocking, it's not a bad thing, but, again, maybe you would like to see them be competitive. This was a blowout in both games. Neither of these games were ever close, despite what the scoreline would tell you, and that's a sad thing to say for KDF fans, but for T1, you know, this is very good. You're happy to get the win, but as I've been saying for, what, like 7 weeks now in a row, or something like that, it's really just about T1 versus Gen.G at this point. Top 2 have solidified themselves as the 2 best teams in the region, and their next series is really going to determine where that goes. And then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and a top 6 team versus a bottom 4 team, going as expected. FearX taking on KT Rolster, and KT is going to pick up the 2-0 series win here. Great. Finally, KT kind of getting back on track at least a little bit here. This team has looked kind of disastrous over the last few weeks. Almost all of the goodwill that they had started to generate has fallen off with a lot of fans because of just how inconsistent they have been over the last few weeks. And, you know, I hate to say it, but this is exactly who we kind of all expected KT to become, with Pioshik and Barrel and even Deft to an extent being these ridiculously volatile players. They're going to have great moments. They're going to have miserably bad moments. It's just kind of what you have to live with a team like this. But around 500 is, I think, what I was expecting from this team in the preseason. And, you know, them beating Fox is certainly not a surprise. For Fox, like, they are just a bad version of Hanwha Life. Like, it is basically the same construction of roster, although I do think you have maybe a little bit of a jungle situation going on, but you are like Hanwha Life, but just slightly worse at it in almost every conceivable way. And that means that you're just not really able to compete with teams that are particularly good at the current moment. And you know, we'll talk about that as we get further along, but for KT Rolster, player of the series is going to go to Perfect in the top lane. This is the best series that he has played in the LCK, in my opinion. I was pretty high on Perfect, almost really high on Perfect coming into the split. I thought he was the best top laner in Challengers League last year, over Thanatos, over, other players that I think were really popular by a lot of LCK analysts. I really liked what I saw from Perfect, and I thought this was a really good promotion. He has not really adapted in the way that I would like super quickly. Obviously, a very resource-heavy player when he was in Tier 2. Hasn't gotten those resources because you have Pioshik, Deft, and Barrel on this team who are going to get resources every single game. So he's kind of just been this weak side top laner that isn't good enough to go up against the best ones in the league just yet. But this was the series where it's like, okay, if you give him an inch, he can take a mile. He can be a resource carry from the top side of this map. He was awesome. The TF game in game 1 was really good, but this is really for the Gwen game in game 2 that I thought was fantastic from him. Just really impressive stuff. Hopefully he can keep that development up. Again, I was really high on him for a reason. His mechanics are insane. He can carry games at a super high level. He just really hasn't been given the opportunity to do that yet at the LCK level. I thought Pioshik was also very good here. It looks like it's going to be a good Pioshik week, which I think is a positive. Obviously, it goes back and forth on a week-to-week basis when it comes to Pioshik, but the good weeks that he's had have been the best weeks of any jungler in the LCK. So you'll take 2 games of Lee Sin where he's just able to outplay Willer and really take advantage of some of the bad plays that, Clear and Closer in particular were making. Deft was good here. I thought BDD played his most consistent series in a while. I've been really harsh on how BDD has played so far in 2024. He's not winning lane. He's not really doing anything outside of lane. I get it. He's playing a super low resource style because Pioshik and Deft in particular are getting a lot of the attention on this team, but still, he's not been good in isolated situations where it's really up to his mechanical skill. He's not been on the level of the top 4 mid laners. Obviously, Chovy and Faker are kind of in their own category in the top 2, but I think Zeka and Showmaker have clearly been better than BDD across this split so far, so need to see a lot of improvement there. Barrel still feast or famine flipping games and costing KT some consistency in the support position, but, some of those engages were super worth it, so you live with it. But for KT, they're just too volatile, right? Like, this is a great win, and hopefully the rest of this week continues to go well for them. It's not a particularly difficult week, but we've seen this team, and this doesn't change my opinion on what we've seen in the past couple of weeks. And then for Fox, I mean, again, it's just the continuation of this horrible skid. We talked about this before this ever happened. They were going to go on this 8-9 series loss streak because they only played the top 5 teams in a row on that, on this streak. There's this ridiculous scheduling thing where they have all the worst teams in their first 3 or 4 series, and then all of the worst teams again at the end of the season, and in the middle, it's all just the top 5 or 6 teams in the league. It's ridiculous how their schedule has ended up working out, so it's not surprising to see them go on this skid. I don't want to freak out about it, but, this team is what it is. Dud of the series is going to go to Closer, and, I'm going to say this. I feel pretty confident in my ability to say this. Closer is what everyone thinks Zeka is. Zeka gets all this criticism for being a regular season player and for being a small champion pool guy, when that's been proven not true. Even the casters are joking about it at this point. Reddit is just clearly not, catching on and on the same page. Closer is what Reddit thinks that Zeka is. He's a small champion pool, kind of one play style guy that really isn't mechanically talented enough to be an upper echelon, player at a level like this. He's okay. He's not the worst mid laner in the league or anything, but when you put him on Karma and ask him to enable a Graves, he's just not going to be able to do that, and he was win trading in this series. He was awful for Fox, and again, this is just what's going to happen when you take him out of his comfort zone, because unlike Zeka, who is relatively relatively adept at being able to switch up his style, even if he's not perfect mechanically on every champion. Closer has one style and one way that he likes to play the game and really isn't able to move away from that in any conceivable way, as we've seen from his career in the LCK. So not shocking to see him struggle. Clear was also pretty bad here. He's been pretty bad across this split. There's been some top laners that have been worse, but Clear, I think, has been what I expected him to be, which is a lower tier top laner. Perfect was able to take advantage of him, and, Perfect has not really been able to destroy a lot of people in lane so far. Hanwha and Execute were fine. This was one of the series where they were relevant, I guess, if only because Beryl was just feeding Hanwha gold throughout this game on the Smolder, making it a lot more difficult for KT to end this as clean as possible, but at least they were able to capitalize on that, and Willer continues to be fine for this team, if a bit feast or famine. He's had some great games, even in losses. He's had some really bad games that have lost in series. He's trying. I still think he's the most interesting player on this team, but Fox is firmly number 7 for me. Again, they destroyed all of the bottom 3 teams when they played them last, but this run of form has just been brutal. They've only played good teams, and once this is done at the end of the week, I think things are going to get better once again for Fox. But for KT on the other side, hopefully they can continue this. I mean, they should be walking out of this week 8-6 in terms of how their schedule has ended up working out. And so, you're excited to see where this goes, but you're going to need to see some consistency develop from this team, and it's got to be against teams that aren't in the bottom 4 like Fox is. And then moving on now to day number 3, our middle day of the week here in the LCK, of course, and it's a pretty big blowout between OK, Brion, and Hanwha Life Esports that kicks off day number 3. Not a particularly shocking outcome, but once again reiterating the fact that, Hanwha, they got destroyed earlier this week by Gen.G, and it really does look like the top 2 teams in the LCK are just head and shoulders above everybody, and that includes Hanwha Life at number 3, but Hanwha is still by far the best of the rest, in my opinion. I think they proved that once again in this series. Obviously, Bro's not the toughest of opponents, but this was a really good look for them. They got to play a lot of the things that they're very comfortable on, and they executed on it very well. This was very much what they had shown in previous weeks leading up to that big matchup with Gen.G, a very similar style. We kind of know how this team is going to be playing from here on out, but for Bro, it's just not good. Like, this team's not very good. They're not really able to be competitive in games where teams are actually good against them, and so, it is what it is, but, it's not a surprise. We'll talk about Hanwha Life, of course, first player of the series, no-brainer, going to go to Zeka. Really great stuff once again coming in from Zeka. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised to hear he is tied for Faker in terms of player of the series for me on this channel. I don't think a lot of people saw that coming, but he is third or tied for second, I guess, in player of the series in all of the LCK in relation to everyone in the entire region. And so that's pretty darn good. He's having a pretty good split, and, I've been on his back the entire time. Obviously, the Reddit comments are going to be what they are, and people are going to have weird and outlandish takes both in the good and bad direction for Zeka, but generally, I think he slots in as one of the better mid laners in the world, and certainly one of the ones with the higher upside. Is he going to be as perfectly consistent game to game as, Chovy and Faker are? Probably not. He's just not as good as those players are, but he is that next tier. He is that, A- and not that A+ kind of player, and I think it really does help Hanwha Life out a lot. He was amazing here. Tristana was very good. The Ahri was very good. His champion pool is a lot wider than people give him credit for, and he still looked good here. Viper continues to look really good, but I thought Delight was actually much better in this series. Not that he's been bad at all. It just really feels like Zeka and Viper winning games for this team, and Delight, basically ever since the return from Lunar New Year break, has been just kind of good, not necessarily great. Not that elite support that I think everybody wanted him to be this year. He kind of got back to that in this series. Great engages coming out, just being the big playmaker for HLE. That's what you want to see. You want to see him set up the Smolder and the Zeri that are obviously really strong right now. And credit to Viper, he still piloted them well. He's still the best AD carry in the LCK. I think that has become apparent throughout this year. He is very consistent, and that's really kind of the big strength of him, is you don't need to give him resources. You don't really need to do anything. He's going to win, and he's going to be able to carry games with the gold he's able to generate for himself. Think of a player like Teddy, but infinitely better, like just infinitely more mechanically talented and able to execute with those low resources. So Zeka, Viper, Delight, they've been the core of this team so far this year, and that absolutely was not changing in this series. But for Bro on the other side, they're just not good. Like, what do you want me to say about this team? They played poorly. Morgan's going to get done of the series. That's kind of a sad thing to say because he did play well in their win earlier this week, but, he is a bit of a volatile player, and Doran actually had a good series. The TF, the Gwen, it was relatively solid. Mostly Morgan is getting this for game number 1 on that Aatrox, where he did just kind of run it after the early game. His team fighting was really poor, but, Gideon wasn't good. Karis got mega gapped by Zeka, and Karis was really bad this week. Not that that, again, is surprising to anybody who's been watching the LCK. You could make an argument that of the mid laners that are still in the league, like, maybe only Call Me has been worse across this year than Karis, and it's been a running trend for him for a while. Envy and Polu weren't great. Envy tried his best to get some gold in this game and really tried to play aggressive, tried to match Viper and Delight's style, and I think that did help Bro for a little bit, but there was only so much that this bot lane was ever going to be able to do. They had no pressure coming from jungle. They had no pressure from mid or top, and even bot lane, started to lose in the mid game. It's not like they were winning skirmishes or winning fights or anything like that. They were just getting, pickup kills in these fights where they would die and lose 4-2, but, those 2 kills went to Envy, so maybe you can do something on it. There were moments where it's like, okay, well, I can see an avenue back in, but they're just not good enough to be able to execute on that, especially against a really good team like HLE. And unfortunately is just the case for Bro. They are a team that is going to be lackluster near the bottom. Bottom 3 teams I just do not see having a lot of competitive streak down the stretch of this year. But for HLE, this again is a very nice win. Does kind of prove the point that they are the best of the rest and not necessarily a contender, but hopefully Zeka can really start to level up. Viper's good enough, Delight's good enough, and Zeka's been good enough this year to actually be able to compete with those upper tier teams. It didn't happen earlier this week, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible for it to happen later on. You just got to keep building this confidence and proving to yourself that it's not some impenetrable barrier that you can't break through. And then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and, top 6 team versus bottom 3 team. It went as expected. NS RedForce taking on Dplus KIA. I hate to really feel like I'm just repeating myself over and over and over again, but the LCK honestly is a bit predictable in its current state. The best teams are just so much better than the bottom teams. The bottom teams would be bad teams in any major region, in the LCS, in the LEC, in their current construction, that, top tier LCK teams, even if they're inconsistent, are going to be able to take them down relatively easily, and unfortunately Nongshim is that, but this series was a lot more competitive than the one earlier on this day. Both of these games were actually kind of back and forth, specifically game 1, but game 2, there were a lot of good moments from Nongshim as well. I actually think they played well, but it's just kind of the story of their season so far, looking competitive, looking okay in these series that they're just not able to take games in against good teams, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how good you look. If you lose every single game, you're not really gaining anything, you're not going anywhere, and especially for year 2 of this rebuild where you essentially just run back. I mean, this is the run back of the roster from last year, this game in particular, because you benched Call Me in the mid lane, and so really, what are you accomplishing? You're the worst team in the LCK right now, and you've had this roster for 2 years. It doesn't feel like it's gotten better, even if it's getting close. But before we get into that, let's get into DK and let's talk about their win. You would have liked it to be a bit more clean, but look at the draft they had in game 2. It was never going to be clean. Kalista plus Aurelion Sol, like, there's just no way that this game is clean from DK. It's impossible for them, but obviously, jokes aside, Showmaker is going to get player of the series. It's actually insane, like genuinely insane how good the mid laners in the LCK are at the top level right now. We talked about the Big 5. BDD has not necessarily lived up to that this year, in my opinion, but the Big 4, they might be the 4 best players in the LCK. It's crazy. Like, Chovy and Faker are the MVP frontrunners, and Zeka and Showmaker are, for me, number 3 and 4. Like, it really has been, like, the 4 best players in the league are all mid laners so far in 2024, and that includes Showmaker. He has been very good, easily the most consistent and best player for this team. Pulls out the A-Soul here in game 2. We're seeing this a lot over in North America. Obviously, they're a patch ahead, and so not surprising to see the LCK copy us again, but, Showmaker plays A-Soul well. If you want to be able to get to that late game, give yourself a bit of an insurance policy, especially after how that game number 1 went, where you draft Talia, Lucian, Nami, and you're just not able to close it out fast enough before you need, like, Kingen to save you on the Aatrox towards the back half of the game. It's really kind of an insurance policy to get that A-Soul in the draft, and I do think they executed on it well. Like, I can't be particularly mad. Showmaker's really good at this game. He's not going to get killed by aggressive engages from a Graves Ahri, even if they're trying their absolute best. So credit to him. He is the best player on this team, but Kingen did have a good series. This might be the best one that he's had so far on DK. I haven't really talked about him a ton this year because he's really not winning. He's really not, he's kind of surviving, but he's more of like a average to below average player, like right on the average. Not really somebody that I'm freaking out about, but really not somebody that's generating it leads and advantages for this team, but he did have a very good team fighting series on both the Aatrox and the Gnar. I thought it was very impressive to see that. Aiming and Kellen were much better in that second game, really not falling off as hard as they did on the Lucian Nami or being as irrelevant on the Lucian Nami as they were. And Lucid I thought was fine. If a little bit over-aggressive, he continues to be a bit of a concern for me. Not somebody that I'm 100% sold on, but Showmaker is good enough to get this team into top 4 basically by himself with how he's playing. And aiming was amazing last week, even if he is just kind of fine in most of the series that they end up playing. DK is still a scary team, and they're hot right now. I know their schedule's gotten easier, and it's going to pick up in difficulty as we, head down the end of the year, but right now it looks pretty good for them. And then for Nongshim on the other side, worst team in the LCK, I think it's a fair thing to say. I mean, DRX is bad, Bro is bad, like all these teams are bad. The bottom 3 are just not very good, but you did put up a fight once again in this series, but we've talked about it so much. I was high on Nongshim to an extent because it's like, okay, well, at least they're losing gracefully, unlike DRX and unlike Bro, who are just getting blown out by everybody that they go up against. Nongshim is at least putting up a fight, and they look interesting in some of these losses. But at the end of the day, if you can't win, it doesn't matter how good your losses are. Like, again, this team has been given so much time. These players have been given so much time, and it's just not happened. Fiesta had a really good series and played relatively well. I would expect him to stay in and be probably their mid laner for at least the upcoming week or the rest of this week. Sylvie was really good in Game 2, even if he was miserable in Game 1 on the Poppy. Jiwoo and Peter are fine. Jiwoo is amazing. He's a really good player and does not deserve to be on the 10th place LCK team. But it is what it is. Unfortunately, dead of the series is once again going to go to Din Din in the top lane. Of all the players in this series, he was the one that was by far the least relevant and the most negatively impactful towards his team, and that's just a really upsetting thing to hear. I do think there have been strides made by Din Din so far in 2024, but I don't think those strides have been enough to actually make him a super consistently good top laner, especially going into someone like Kingen. You would expect him to be able to survive. Kingen's not been playing all that great this series, certainly not been dominating people in the laning phase, but Kingen was so much more useful than Din Din throughout this series. And so while those advancements, while some of those progressions have been taken, it's just really not enough. He still has a lot of those bad games that we were cautioning everybody about last year. There's a lot of real question marks, but again, Nongshim just feels like one of those teams that's consistently going to be in games, but it's never really going to win them. And if that's who they are, that's who they are. That's going to be a team that needs to make changes, but I'm not entirely sure they have the guts to do so. And then for DK on the other side, again, Showmaker's looking great. As long as he's looking good, I think this team is going to be looking good, but they're going to need more than him if they want to be a complete team. Remember, in spring, you got to get top 2 in order to make an international tournament, and DK right now just feels very far away from that. I really like Showmaker, and Aiming and Kellen I think have been playing better, but topside still concerns me, and specifically Lucid concerns me in the jungle going forward because he's really not been great over the course of this split. If they can, continue this hot streak and, build upon that and get into some of these harder matchups and still do well, I'm going to be really happy to see that, but I just don't know if I can entirely believe in them more than anyone in the top 3 right now. And then moving on now to day number 4, and finally we get to it. The series everybody's been waiting to talk about and to see, in the LCK here ever since week 1, ever since we got the last result between these two teams. It's a battle between the 2 best teams in the region and 2 of the best teams in the world. T1 taking on Gen.G. And Gen.G picks up a dominant 2-0 win once again here. That is 4-1 on the regular season against T1 here, and at this point, it's just the trend for them. This is just what they do. They beat T1. This is what they've done for the past year, essentially, going back to the spring finals. Ever since the spring finals of 2023 last year, Gen.G is 20-8 in games against T1. They are 8-1 in series against T1. The only series that they've lost to T1 since spring finals of last year was a 5-game 3-2 win for T1 at MSI last year. Outside of that, they've not been able to beat them, and that includes a win at Worlds, and so you've got to give a lot of credit to Gen.G. They beat them in the playoffs twice in summer of last year. They beat them in the regular season both times this year. They beat them at Worlds last year. This is just a team that has T1's number, and I think, we're starting to crack the code as to why. I think mechanical differences can really make a big difference in League of Legends. Who would have seen that coming? It turns out when you are one of the best mechanical teams in the world that is very controlled, that doesn't want to, play super aggressive and flip a lot of these games with aggressive fights, then oftentimes T1's not really left with a lot of answers, and the things that Gen.G does well are just able to be done at a super high level. So let's talk about it. Player of the series, it can go to a lot of people. You want to give it to Canyon or Lehens. We'll talk about them. They were both terrific. Pays was terrific in this series, but Chovy is going to get it once again for me. Chovy. I mean, really, what else is there to say right now? He, in my opinion, especially after the series, is the clear-cut favorite for MVP as we get closer and closer towards the end of the split. He's been the best player in the world, in my opinion, so far in 2024. I don't even think it's really up for debate. There are good players in the world right now, but I don't think anyone's even remotely come to match Chovy. He has been number one by far, in my opinion, in terms of what he's been able to do. He was point and click on the Ahri. The dude was bot lane for like 7,000 years. He ganked bot like 3 or 4 times before 10 minutes and still had 10 CS per minute. You know, it's something ridiculous. Like, there's just not a player like him where he can be everywhere on the map, make a huge difference in fights, actively get his bot lane ahead by himself, and also not fall behind in gold or farm or anything like that. He's broken. Like, he's a difference maker. It's ridiculous how well he's playing. So credit to Chovy. You know, this hopefully is the year that people start actually putting some respect on his name. But once again, he's having a ridiculous split. It might even be one of his best ever. And then I got to talk about the bot lane here, because holy crap was the bot lane good. I think this was one of the big problems for T1 is their bot lane just kind of got smashed in this series. They didn't really have a chance. Guma and KIA were not even remotely on the same level as what Paze and Lehens were offering as a bot lane duo, and that's huge. I mean, Paze has kind of been the silent player for Gen.G, certainly more of a background player than a lot of than basically everybody else on this team, and you know, it's because he's not getting the resources. It's because he's more of that late game, you know, kind of don't really give me a lot of pressure in lane kind of player. And I think it does hurt his ability to be more noticeable in games with Chovy and Lehens and Canyon. But the talent is still there because Paze massacred Gumayushi in this series in lane. Even on the Aphelios in game number 1, he still was better in lane, but specifically that Kalista game, it's just a masterclass on how to play an aggressive laning phase against a Lucian to make sure he has absolutely no prio. Credit to Lehens, he was just as good, especially on the Renata in game number 2, and KIA definitely let his own AD carry down, but Paze has to be given a lot of credit too. And then Canyon, 2 games of Rel with some phenomenal engages. This guy is locked in at the moment. Like I said earlier this week, I really do believe this is the best version of Canyon since 2021, and that's massive for Gen.G fans. I mean, Keen's not struggling on the top side. Zeus was useless in this series, and Gen.G just feels like they're clicking on all cylinders. Neither of these games were close, and this was the series everybody was waiting for. I'm not just crowning them. I'm not saying that they're 100% going to be the best team in the world no matter what, but right now it's really hard to argue that they're anything but the best team in the world at the moment. But for T1 on the other side of this, you obviously would have loved to win at least a game here like you did in week number 1, but you kind of got destroyed in both of these games, which is definitely a bit disappointing. Dud of the series is going to go to Gumayushi for me. Again, the bot gap was really large. Guma just didn't really get to play the game, and a lot of that was him being over-eager and over-aggressive in the bot lane. Like, he just got outplayed, and that's going to happen every once in a while. I'm not sitting here and trying to say that him getting outplayed is a disaster and it's unplayable for T1 because now this bot lane's bad or yada, yada, yada. I'm not going to overreact, but it is worth noting that Guma got outplayed. Paze was better, and Lehens was better than KIA in this series, and so, you know, not great from the bot lane. Faker didn't really get to do a whole ton. He lost in lane isolated to Chovy, as everybody in the world does, but he didn't even have the map impact to be able to keep up with that. Owner was so far behind by 15 minutes every single game that he didn't even really get to play. The scoreline's probably worse than he ended up playing, but again, he's also been kind of nothing this year. In my opinion, he's been the weakest member of T1, and I really have not been all that excited about what Owner has offered as a jungler so far in 2024, and he already was my biggest concern on this team going into the year, and so that's definitely starting to creep up into my mind, and Zeus couldn't really do anything to save it on the top side. When your bot lane loses like this, when jungle doesn't have any pressure, when mid lane is just outclassed, and it's Faker getting outclassed, at that point, you just have to say GG. Like, what else is there to say? You have some of the most talented players in the world, but Gen.G just had better ones today, and that's just, it is what it is. But for Gen.G, again, I mean, are they the best team in the world? Right now, I think they've got a really solid case to make in that regard. Whether it's them or Billy Gaming or whoever you want to put in that spot, I think Gen.G has, at the very least, earned to be in that conversation. Chovy is the best player in the world at the current moment, and with the way he's playing, Lehens and Canyon are playing out of their minds. Keen has been really good, and Paze really dominated and stepped up when he needed to the most after kind of a quiet start to the spring split. This team is just so complete, they're so stacked, they're so mechanical, and they're so composed. I really don't see a lot of avenues to be able to beat them consistently, and that's what makes them so scary. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and it is actually an upset. A bottom 3 team picking up a win over someone not in the bottom 3. It's the Kwangdong Freecs taking on DRX. And DRX picking up the 2-0 series win. Massive for them, obviously. They've looked so much better in the recent weeks. Ever since putting Yehu into the mid lane, it really does feel like that's unlocked a lot of the pieces on this team, specifically Sponge in the jungle, who actually is competent. Like, he has, like, figured out how to play the game once again. Getting Yehu back in here, they have gone a lot slower. They have gone a lot more controlled. Not the kind of exciting league that maybe you would have expected from a team that's trying to break their way out of the bottom 3, but still, whatever works, works, right? Like, if you're going to win games, it doesn't really matter how you get there. So, again, good stuff from DRX, especially as a nice bounce back from earlier this week. And then for KDF on the other side, disaster is striking. You are 6-8. And truthfully, if there was anybody in the bottom 4 that could even remotely, compete in the middle of the split, then this would be a very scary time for KDF fans, because in most situations, this team would be on the brink of losing their playoff spot, being that final team in it right now. But because the league is so, not good at the bottom of the standings, even though they're on this giant losing streak and really falling off right now, it's pretty inevitable that they're still going to make the playoffs. They could lose out and likely still make the playoffs, and that's pretty crazy, but we'll talk about that later. Let's start with DRX. Player of the series was kind of hard because I do think this is more of a team effort, but in terms of flashiness, it absolutely has to go to Teddy. 2 games of Smolder where he just got so fed in the mid game and really was able to just end the game super fast. Teddy did a lot of good things, I would say here. Bull and Ondil have been really bad in the last couple of weeks. We talked about that earlier this week. We're definitely not going to stop talking about that in this series. That's definitely the case, but I think Teddy did a good job of knowing exactly where to play his power spikes. Again, he's not an awful player. I'm significantly lower on Teddy than the consensus, as anybody who's watched this channel for more than 2 seconds probably already knows, but the thing I'm low about when it comes to Teddy is the fact that he doesn't generate his own resources. Like, he's not the kind of player who's going to win on his own and actually do something with it. If you give him a lot of resources, if you put him in a position where he can essentially just kind of do his job at a high level, he's really good at doing his job. He's really good at doing the things that AD carries do. He just doesn't really go above and beyond. But in this series where you're playing Smolder both games, you have a Karma who's winning a lot in the mid lane, enabling a Xin Zhao to just funnel you gold over and over again. Yeah, the game spiraled out of control really quick, and Teddy was the most important player because of that, so credit to him. I do think that in the Teddy hype, though, a lot of credit is lost on Pliata, who's just been so good across this split, in my opinion. He has been the best player on DRX for most of this year. I know everybody's going to say it's Teddy. I think the bot lane has been the best part because they've won at least pseudo consistently, but man, he's such a good laner, and he's really good out of lane too. This guy is a legit support. He's somebody who I think is actually going to make it here in the LCK. I don't really know if it's going to be on this team, because it really does feel like this team is in a pretty big major rebuilding process right now, and I certainly don't think Teddy's the kind of AD carry that's going to push him to the next level. You just aren't really ever going to play through Teddy in the same way that you would some of the other AD carries, but he is really good, and when you get 2 games of Smolder and you get to play Bard and Rakan and these playmaking supports, yeah, it can work out pretty well. So credit to him. I thought Rascal and Sponge were relatively good too. Sponge in particular really was enabled by Ye, who is a lot more controlled, a lot calmer in the mid lane. With Satab, you had a lot of these, mid-game skirmishes, and that's kind of what he was good at, but the team generally didn't play around it well, and even when Satab was succeeding on his own, it really didn't mean a whole ton because they couldn't translate it into anything. But with Yehu being a lot more willing to kind of give up resources, play for team fighting, not really take a lot of, I guess, gold and experience himself, and kind of want to give that to his jungler in Sponge, I think it's really helped Sponge settle in, and he had a really good series here on Zim. Rascal, like I said, was also really solid, was very good in game number 1 on the Malphite. That champion continues to look good whenever it's been picked, because it's usually in pretty good situations, even though game number 1 wasn't exactly the ideal Malphite situation. Nonetheless, it still ended up working out. DRX was just the better team in this series, so good on him. And then bad on him for KDF for not being the better team out of these 2 in this series. That's kind of a disaster. It's kind of worst case scenario, and I'm kind of freaking out, but only in the sense that, a team that once was, a team that was very interesting in terms of the playoff race, could have been, top 5, maybe even top 4-ish if everything went right, is firmly the worst team that's going to make the playoffs and will probably be an easy out in the way that they're currently playing. Bot lane is just completely gone. I don't know what happened in week 2 and week 3 to get these guys rolling in the way that they were, but Ondil has completely regressed. He's going to get another dud of the series here. Bull has been horrible over the past 2 weeks in particular, but really it's been the past three to four-ish weeks that have not been good for him. It's just not looked good for the bot lane here for KDF. This is much more like what you would have expected with these names before the start of 2024. So unfortunate that ended up happening, but they're really not playing well in any way. Teddy really gapped them, and Yehu really did a lot of damage to them in terms of the pressure he was able to create. Bulldog, I think, had a rough series. It's going to happen every once in a while. I still like Bulldog, but wasn't very good from him. Cuz is very feast or famine. When the team is playing bad, he is going to absolutely run it down, as we saw here, and it's not like Dudu did anything to change that. Rascal's been one of the worst top laners, if not the worst top laner in the LCK this year, and Dudu lost to him in lane twice, and so, yeah, there's reason to be concerned when it comes to KDF. A lot of the positives that we had come to know with this team, they're just not there right now, and if this is the case, I mean, 6 wins on the split is actually like 6-12 is like a super doable record for them at the end of the year if they continue to play like this. But for DRX, nice win, 3-11. Like, you're probably still not going to make playoffs unless some miracle happens down the stretch, but you are looking better, and I think that's encouraging heading into the second half of the year. I don't really know what changes you might want to make. Sponge was miserable for most of this year, but Yehu seems to have calmed him down a bit. I don't know if you want to go out and try to get players to push for a playoff run in summer like you did last year, but whatever you want to end up doing, you know, it's certainly become a lot more complicated because of how well they played in the last 2 weeks, at least in terms of the grand scheme of things. And that's going to bring us to our final day of LCK action here in week number 7, and we kicked our 5th and final day off with a battle of red teams. KT Rolster taking on NS RedForce, and KT is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They still drop a game to NS, who continues to go, yeah, we can win 1 game per series. You know, we have a really good bot laner and a really good bot lane just in general, a bot lane that is very competitive, but outside of that, we just have no way of winning games, and even when they play well, it's still a coin flip whether or not we're actually even going to be in the game in the first place by the time they get fed, and KT was able to kind of get their shit together, if you will, and so, you know, credit to them. They got a lot better as the series kind of winded down. Game 2 was really messy from them, but games 1 and 3 were both really good in my opinion. So let's talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Pioshik once again. He's got a lot of player of the series this split, but it's very funny because his bad series are like very noticeable. I'm not going to try and sit here and say that he's been bad by any means. I just don't think I would put him in the MVP conversation. All-Pro, I think, is going to be super doable. Like, he could be first or second team All-Pro super easily, but in terms of, like, comparing him to, like, the mids in the LCK right now, the best mid laners, I just don't think he's been on the same level in terms of how he's been able to take over the games. Still, when he is able to win games and win series for his team, it does look very good. This was akin to what we saw for a lot of, like, week 1, 2, and 3 before the Lunar New Year break. So credit to Pioshik. That's what we wanted to see, is him come out and actually really start to dominate some of these series mechanically like he was doing at the beginning of the year. The Rel was really good in game 1. The Vi was very good in game number 3. And I think without both of those setting up for a lot of the rest of the carries, I think that this series becomes a lot harder to win. A lot of people are going to be drawn to the pentakill that Deft got because it's Deft's first pentakill ever. That almost feels wrong. It almost feels impossible that that's the first pentakill Deft ever got in the LCK, but Zeri will do that for you in game number 3. And, you know, Deft obviously played really well, being able to take over some of those fights. Zeri is a champion that you do need skill to execute on. It's not just this plug-and-play easy pentakill champion, although it kind of is if you get super fed. But, you know, in this context, I don't think it was particularly easy because of where Jiwoo was. So credit to Deft. I thought he played really well. Beryl was much better in this series. He's been a little bit more wild and crazy in the last 2 series than he was at the beginning of the year. Some of the bad Beryl tendencies have been starting to come back out. So this was a nice series to remind you that, you know, he can still reel it in. He can still be a little bit more controlled, a little bit more of a facilitator. This was good. BDD was fine in this series. Certainly wasn't the problem, wasn't really the solution, but all he needs to do is, like, stay alive in lane. He's been a really bad laner this split, so as long as he can not do that, I think this team's going to be fine in that front. And then Perfect was also the better top laner, carrying over from some of the good stuff he showed earlier this week. But good for Pioshik, good for Deft, good for Beryl. Once again, this KT team is entirely these 3 former DRX players. That's just going to be how this team ends up functioning. When those 3 are playing well, they're going to win. When those 3 are playing poorly, they are going to lose. There is no in-between, and I think that's become abundantly clear. But for Nongshim, you know, what can I say that I didn't already just say just a couple moments ago? Nongshim is an interesting team that's going to be able to win some games. Jiwoo, in particular, is a really freaking good player. Like, this guy is genuinely close to being, like, a breakout for me. It's kind of similar to how I talked about Dudu last year on KDF, where it was like, the Kwangdong Freecs are awful. They're really, really bad, and they don't really have a lot going for them, but if you took Dudu from this team and put him on a top team, I think he would survive and look really good in those circumstances. Maybe in 2024, you can compare him to someone like Yucal over in the LPL, on Thunder Talk, who's been playing really well, but Jiwoo is just he's on a really bad team, and he's a really good player. And Peter, to his credit, is also playing really well. He's not quite as good as Jiwoo, and certainly not as consistent. He'll have more bad games than someone like Jiwoo will, but he's still been really good for most of this year. You don't get there as an AD carry the way that Jiwoo has consistently at least one game a series if your support is just running it down. I think these two have very good chemistry, and I think if you had a halfway decent topside, perhaps this series is winnable, but you didn't in this one. Sylvie's going to get out of the series, and honestly, Fiesta and Call Me are both lucky that they only played one of the losses apiece. Fiesta was horrible in game 1, so they benched him for Call Me, who was pretty good in game 2, but then was also horrible in game number 3. They both were individually the worst players in their 2 losses, but neither of them played both games, and Sylvie was bad in both games, so he takes the cake. He gets the Dud of the Series award. Just big jungle gap here. Sylvie was looking so good. I wouldn't say so good, but, you know, better. Like, noticeably better for a lot of this split than he was in 2023, and it's just kind of all come collapsing back down into what he was last year, and it's just disappointing. The progress has kind of gone backwards, and that's not really the development that you wanted to see. Din Din is just not a very good top laner at this level, even if he didn't get demolished, but poor Jiwoo, again, like, mid and jungle were just so bad in this series, there was never going to be an opportunity for him to carry this team, and he really tried in all 3 games, even in the 2 losses, he really did try, but Nongshim is just not good enough. This is the worst team in the league, and that was accentuated by the fact that they couldn't win with an AD carry that was as strong as Jiwoo was, and so it is what it is. You gotta live with it for Nongshim, but for KT, again, nice win, solid win. I still don't feel great about this team because of the inherent inconsistency of Pioshik, Deft, and Beryl as a trio, but at least we know they can beat teams that are even more inconsistent and even more feast or famine than they are, like Nongshim is, and that's a good sign. They're probably pretty clearly, in my opinion, the 5th best team in the LCK right now. I think really, honestly, everybody from 1 to 10 feels pretty locked in their spots in terms of how things have worked out, and KT is definitely not immune to that. And that is going to bring us to our final series of the week here in the LCK, and it is a top team versus bottom team matchup, as we've seen a couple of times this week. FearX taking on Dplus KIA, and Dplus KIA is going to pick up the 2-1 win. They don't bottle it here. FearX finally is going to end this monstrous stretch of games where they essentially went from like 3-1, I think they were 3-1, maybe they were 3-2, something around there, and now they're 3-10, right? They had to play all the good teams back to back to back to back. Well, now that's over, but for DK, they are still able to take advantage of that while it presents itself, so big stuff from them. FearX is just not good enough to be able to compete with the best teams in the league, and it's unfortunate the way their schedule ended up working out, but DK is about to go through something very similar. It's very interesting because there are a lot of people online that think this team is a huge fraudulent team, that they're not particularly good. I'm not really sure if it's fair to call them frauds because I don't think they're pretending to be a top 3 team. Like, I don't think anybody really believes they're a top 3 team, so to say that they're frauds for being the 4th best team in the league, which I think right now they are, I think it's a relatively accurate statement. This team is fine. They're certainly more consistent than KT Rolster and Kwangdong Freecs, but I don't know if I would necessarily say they're guaranteed to be better, but I think that's kind of the general consensus that a lot of people have. They're only 1 game above KT Rolster. I wouldn't necessarily say that they are frauds, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Kellen. I don't think they win this series if they don't have Kellen. I honestly think he was that big of a deal, especially in game number 3. If that Ash Arrow does not come out, they lose that game instantly. Like, I know I'm a bit of a Kellen defender on this channel, but you've got to call out when he's important to this team, and he was very important in this series. Obviously, you don't get to that point if Kingan's not still super strong on the Renekton, able to fight really consistently with the team, or if Showmaker just doesn't have a really good series like he did. He continued to look great here. You're not in that spot, but without Kellen, you also don't win, which is why he is going to get my player of the series. I also think he's been pretty good this year. Maybe not the superstar that he was 2 years ago, where I really thought he was breaking out as one of the top, 3 to 5 supports in the world back in 2022. I think that was a pretty fair thing to say. It just didn't carry over to 2023. He was still good, and I think he's been about what he was last year for this team this year, which is solid. Aiming has been really good when he gets enabled, and Kellen's done a good job of trying to enable him, but it's really all about Showmaker on this team. So Kellen's taken mostly a backseat, but his Tahm Kench is actually really good. People forget how good he was on this champion, when it first came out. Like, he's always been a Tahm Kench player, so to see him play it again here in game 2 to and play it well. Obviously, Kellen matters a lot to this team, but shout out to Showmaker. He is the carry, especially when he gets to play his LeBlanc, one of his best champions. So fun to watch. How can you not love Showmaker? He's playing at a super high level. He's been really good all year long, and again, it's the top tier of mid laners that make it very interesting in the LCK, in my opinion, but Kingen also having a really good series here, mostly on that Renekton in game number 3, but pretty good week for Kingen. I would argue this was the best week he's had since joining DK. He really has not been a difference maker, but this week he kind of was. He was certainly more noticeable in terms of the positive plays he was making, which I think is generally just a good thing overall. You want your top laner to actually be getting involved in some of the team fights and actually be, proving that he can do stuff in the mid game, and it's not really what Kingen has been doing up until this point. Again, I don't think he's been awful. I just don't think he's been good either. Kind of the definition of a mid top laner so far, but he was a little bit more than that this week, which I think is a positive sign. But Lucid continues to be a little bit more hit or miss. I thought he was pretty good in this series, definitely better than Willer down the back half of it, but, he's not really a star for this team. I was really hoping he was going to break in and be a Rookie of the Year favorite, but it's just not going to happen. He's really not taken to the LCK at a super fast level, and I think it will hold DK back, but at least for now, Showmaker plus Kellen is certainly strong. Aiming, I think, has had a pretty good split, and Kingen seems to be getting better as the split goes on. These are all positives that you can take away for DK that make the difficulty of the second half of their schedule, or the rest of their schedule, a little bit more manageable. But for Fox on the other side, they are who they are. I mean, they played relatively okay here. There were moments like Closer looked really good in their win in Game 1. In fact, everybody, I would say, looked good in their Game 1 win. They were the better team in Game 1 by a pretty considerable margin, and they kept things close down the stretch. Credit to Henna, who I think got strong on the Kalista, and Closer as well, who was pretty good on the Tristana. This was a much better series than he had earlier in the week, but unfortunately, dud of the series is going to go to Willer. His player of the series to dud of the series tally is miserable. I think it's like 1-4 or something like that. He's like bottom, 4 or 5 in terms of players in the league for duds of the series, and that's not really, I think, a good encapsulation of how he has played. He hasn't necessarily been good every game, that is definitely for sure. He's lost his team a fair number of series, but also he is like the only driving force of life that this team has for most of their games. It's really hard to say that he has been a massive problem for them because he is the one that is taking the most risks and really the one that's actually trying to do things. So I'm going to credit Willer, even though he played kind of bad in this series, and I'm still going to sit here and talk about how I think this bot lane has been disappointing. Execute in particular, I had such high hopes for him coming into the year, and I've just not been impressed by the tape. His scorelines never end up that bad, but you go and watch some of the tape and it's just not there. The aggressiveness isn't there. The playmaking ability isn't there. He's just kind of reverted into being a meh, like a whatever support, really a not interesting one. And I think that's really sad considering what he was in the LEC for the last 2 years. Really was a game breaker, a difference maker there. Maybe not the best support in the region, but certainly somebody that you had to keep an eye on because he can make a play at any given moment. That's just not who he has been here in the LCK, and that's a bit sad. Henna's been a bit better, I would say, over the second half, which is certainly something to keep an eye on, but most of that is just because the champions that are strong right now are all AD carries, and Clear is just not good enough in the top lane to ever really make a difference. FearX is not a great team. Like, they're not a playoff team. Wouldn't expect them to push the Kwangdong Freecs, even with their schedule getting a bit easier down the stretch, but I don't know, who knows? Like, this team's gone through the ringer and they've lost like 9 series in a row or something like that, 10 series in a row, something around that. And so maybe this is the time for them to break through, or maybe all of those losses ended up destroying and torpedoing this team's confidence. We'll have to see as the season continues on. But for DK, nice win. You're at 9-5. This is a pretty good spot. You just wanted to be above KT Rolster, and that's what you were able to do. Again, you're fighting it out for 4th place at the current moment. I think top 3 are pretty locked. Top 1 is on their, top 2 are kind of on their own pedestal, but, Gen.G feels clearly better right now, and then Hanwha is very clearly number 3. I think DK is very clearly number 4. So long as they continue to beat the teams that are below them in the standings, there's really nothing else I can say. We can call them frauds all we want, but I think they are exactly who everybody thinks they are right now. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK Week 7 overview and analysis video here in the Spring Split. Up on the screen now, you can see the updated standings after 7 weeks of LCK action. Of course, all of the teams are going to be ranked from number 1 to number 10. Any teams highlighted in green have officially qualified for the playoffs. It doesn't mean that they're qualified for any specific stage just yet. Even the top 2 teams have not guaranteed themselves spots in that top 2 because Hanwha Life is holding on to that 11-3 record, and so we do have our first 5 teams to qualify for the playoffs here in Gen.G, T1, Hanwha, DK, and KT. That final playoff spot is technically not locked, but it would take a miracle for KDF to lose it. Again, playoffs have been locked for a little while now. We know who the top 6 have been. But of course, also on the screen, you can see my personal power rankings on the right from number 1 to number 10. Usually, I would say we can see how those have changed from last week to this week in the column right next to it, but they haven't. They have not changed at all from last week. They are the exact same. These teams are in the exact same space that I think they were last week. I think you could make the argument that maybe some of the bottom teams could theoretically move around, but Nongshim is definitely 10, and even with Bro beating DRX went out and beat KDF, and so it's really hard for me to sit here and say that, you know, they're definitely worse. I think it's just a matter of, like, whatever you want to do, like DRX versus Bro at 8 or 9, but to me, that's the only, like, flip point. Maybe put Fox lower, but like, again, they've only played good teams. They beat DRX, Bro, and Nongshim handily when they played them earlier in the year. And I can't put KDF below 6 because nobody else has earned that spot, even with how bad KDF is playing right now. So, no changes to the power rankings. I'm not sure if I've ever done that in the LCK, but, you know, it's going to stay the same, at least until proven otherwise. Let me know if you agree with me not changing anything, or if you think I should have moved a team in one direction or the other. Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below, but moving into my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 7, player of the week is going to go to Canyon, the jungler for Gen.G. He has been outstanding in the last 3 weeks. I've talked about him in these segments as a runner-up before, but he gets the full player of the week here in week 7. Gen.G was on fire. Hanwha Life and T1, the 2 other best teams in the region, and it didn't matter. They were absolutely better than both. A strong week for Gen.G, and a lot of it was because of the jungle pressure that was created from Canyon. It didn't matter if it was Peanut. It didn't matter if it was owner. Canyon was the best jungler in the LCK this week and really made a strong case to be that first team all-pro jungler as we get closer and closer to award season. So really good stuff from Canyon. Runners up for me, Showmaker, the mid laner for DK. DK had another solid week. The games weren't super clean, but Showmaker was the one who showed up in all of those games. They probably don't win either of those series if he's not as good as he is, so pretty easy choice for honorable mention. And then Pioshik, the jungler for KT Rolster, also had a very good week. You know, he's known to have a couple of good weeks. He had quite a few of them at the beginning of the year. Weeks 1 and 2 definitely spring to mind, but the consistency just hasn't been there. He's going to be in this section, and he's also going to be a candidate for dud of the week in other weeks. It's just kind of how Pioshik plays, but this week he had a good one. So it's Canyon getting player of the week, and then dud of the week, unfortunately for me in week 7, is going to go to Ondale, the support for the Kwangdong Freecs. That bot lane has just completely imploded. Whether it's Bull, whether it's Ondale, it's just not working right now, and I thought Ondale was, like, very bad this week, noticeably bad, and, you know, I think the sad thing is that he showed a lot of really good tape, I think, in the first couple weeks. Like, week 2, week 3, I was really getting excited about him in particular. Like, Bull, I was expecting to kind of fall off, but he seemed like someone who could really, you know, keep the momentum going because of how he was playing, but it's really not been that. The KDF bot lane has been a disaster in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it really doesn't seem like there's a lot of reason to believe that it's going to change anytime soon. So Ondale is going to get my dud of the week, but let me know if you guys agree. Let me know if you disagree with the player of the week, the dud of the week, with everything down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We don't only cover the LCK on this channel. This is a perfect time to hit subscribe because the LCS playoffs are actually right around the corner. In fact, the day that this is releasing, we're also going to be doing the LCS weekly recap a couple of hours later. I'll record that after I finish this, and then tomorrow, we're actually going to be uploading my LCS playoff preview with all my awards, all my all-pro selections, and a preview of all 6 teams that ended up making the LCS playoffs. So a lot of good stuff to go over and to talk about in that video. If you're excited for all that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.